Hello and welcome to this National SEND update. My name's Adam Bodderson. I'm delighted to have been invited here today to talk to you about all things SEND and inclusion. For those of you that don't know the organisation I work for, it's NASEN, the National Association for Special Educational Needs. And I'm also chair of the Whole School SEND Consortium, both of which I'll touch on as we go through today's presentation. If you're not already following myself on Twitter or NASEN on Twitter, the handles are there. Please do follow us. We share lots of useful information, not just about NASEN or Whole School SEND, but about the sector more generally. And even if you've got questions following today's presentation that you want to ask about, feel free to tweet them at me and I'll be sure to come back to you. Anyway, I hope today's session is useful. I always say with these kind of national SEND updates, lots of it will confirm things that you already know, but I always hope that people will find at least one thing in here, hopefully more than one thing, that they think actually that's new, and there's a call to action from that where you think, as a result of seeing this session today, I'm going to go and do something different now that I might not have done before. And for me, if everybody who's watching today does that, then it's been very well worthwhile doing this session. Okay, so as I said, let me just start with a brief introduction to NASEN. We are a charitable membership organisation. We've got more than 30,000 members, and as I say, we have free resources, online materials. We've got professional development programmes, webinar programmes, support services for SEND, and we're operating both in the UK and internationally. Our membership is free, so if you're not a member, why not? Please do join up, and the web address is there, nasen.org.uk, and you'll get access to our bi-monthly magazine and lots of the free resources as well. So please do that. I also mentioned earlier on Whole School SEND. Again, you can go and visit the sendgateway.org.uk to find out more about the work of the Whole School SEND Consortium and NASEN's involvement with that in terms of hosting that. And later on, I'm going to come back to some of the specific resources that both NASEN and Whole School SEND have published that may be of particular interest. Okay, on to the update itself. So I think before we kind of dive into a lot of the detail and substance of today, it's worth just setting the scene. And one of the things I like to look at is the national census data. So every January, schools complete the census return for the Department for Education. And as part of that, they indicate the levels of special educational needs and disabilities that they have in their school, and not just how many children have needs, but also what type of needs they have. And all that data is published in July of each year, and actually it's available historically as well, so you can look back at how that's changed over time. And I'll come back to this a bit later on in terms of how you might use that public data set with your own data set to make some interesting observations. But let's just look at the public data set for a moment. So you'll see here the blue line at the top, which represents the total proportion of children with SEND. What you can see here is that that in 2010 there was a peak in terms of the overall proportion of children with SEND, and of course then it started to drop off. And the reason for this, well, there were three things that happened in 2010. First of all, we had a change of government. There was also a change in the way that funding for special educational needs was happening. So prior to 2010, it had been the case that if you had a greater number of children with SEND, then actually you received greater funding, which kind of makes sense, I suppose. But there was a risk or a fear that people might be gaming the system and over-identifying the proportion of children with SEND. So therefore they changed and they moved to this kind of SEN notional budget instead. And of course, Ofsted produced a report in 2010 called "The Statement Is Not Enough," which essentially reinforced that message, which said, head teachers, look, we think that you might be over-identifying the proportion of learners with SEND. So of course, that identification dropped off over time. And it drops off even more sharply in 2014 as the Children and Families Act comes in, and now it's started to pick up again. And what's interesting, if you look at the breakdown of that overall proportion of SEND, there are two levels of SEND. The orange line at the bottom, which is well, it was statements of special educational needs, and it's now education, health and care plans. And that remained pretty constant at 2.8% for more than 10 years. And now it's just started to creep up, and it's almost at 3.5% now. Not quite there, but almost there. And that's putting real pressure on the high needs budgets. And again, I'll come back to that a bit later on. But what you can see is the vast majority of the change happened at the non-statutory end. So this green line here, which in old money represented School Action Plus, and now represents those children who are at the level of SEN support. And a lot of the change was at that level. And there has been recent research from the Education Policy Institute, for example, which questions the accuracy of identification that's actually happening in schools, particularly at that non-statutory end of things. And that's where all the kind of turbulence and changes has been in terms of that wider context. But the point is, all of this has happened in the context of rising pupil numbers, which means that we're in a situation where not only is now the volume of learners with SEND actually going up, but we know that also the complexity is increasing. So it's quite common now for young people to have more than one area of need, and the interaction between them it can be very, very complex. So there are lots of challenges for school leaders in here, lots of challenges for Senkos, lots of challenges for local authorities and all the professionals involved in classroom teachers. Okay, one of the questions I often ask, particularly to school leaders and to governors, is can you name the 4 broad areas of need from the SEND Code of Practice? And sometimes people will say, but we don't need to be experts, do we? Because that's what we've got a Senko for. And I would say, but look, if we don't know the 4 broad areas of need, that means when we talk about young people with SEND, we're talking about them as kind of one homogenous group, because we're not aware of the different types of need that there may be. And I think that's particularly difficult, perhaps if you're a governor who doesn't work routinely in the education space. And so it's even harder for you again. So I would say we want to make sure that all of our leaders in school and all of our governors are able to name the 4 broad areas of need, because that will inject a level of nuance to the discussions that are had, but also to the kind of decisions that are made, because then you might make a completely different decision depending on the proportions of those needs that actually exist in a particular school. Similarly, understanding, once you know what those needs are, actually what are the most prevalent needs. And here I'm thinking of primary areas of needs, so not necessarily the 4 broad areas, but very specific types of need. And that relates back to the census data that I was talking about before. And we just want to make sure that all of that information is routinely feeding into strategic decision making. So what do I mean by that? So for example, if you were making a decision about the content of professional development days over the next year for teachers in your school, and some of that content might be related to SEND and inclusion, then you'd want to make sure that actually the most prevalent SEND and needs may perhaps are echoed in terms of the status and the time that's given to in the CPD programme. That said, there might be lower incidence needs, which are less common, but more complex, and that might need some more time as well. But it's that level of nuance into the strategic decision making that we want to make sure we get in. So I ask those questions really for you to reflect on in terms of your own circumstances, to see where you might be on this. And it may be that you're doing all of this already, in which case, brilliant. It may be that that's not happening, in which case, hopefully this might be one of those things that you take away to think, is there something more we need to do? Okay, thinking about the 4 broad areas of need, as I said before, that everybody needs to know, here they are: communication and interaction, cognition and learning, sensory and or physical needs, and social, emotional, mental health needs. So as I say, we do want head teachers and governors to be familiar with those areas. And I would actually take that one stage further, because where they are listed is in Chapter 6 of the SEND Code of Practice, which is again freely available on the government website, gov.uk. You'll find it there if you do a search. And that Chapter 6 is only 20 pages long. And I would say we really want everyone, particularly our leaders, head teachers and governors, to be really familiar with those 20 pages. And I don't think that would be unreasonable. And that's the chapter that's really focused on SEND in schools. Senkos, on the other hand, might need to be familiar with the whole code of practice, but many of them obviously will be, because they will have covered that at length, no doubt, in the National Senko Award qualification that they undertake. Okay, one of the questions I often get asked about SEND is, look, Adam, there's a lot of pressure on resource in schools. Clearly nobody working in education gets up in the morning because they want to give a bad deal for children, let alone children with SEND. But because of these resource implications and limitations, actually there are pressures that mean we have to make some really hard decisions. So what is it, Adam, that we can do that would really improve SEND and inclusion, but actually won't cost a lot of money or will cost very little? And I've come up with 5 kind of areas that I think are worth consideration in terms of responding to that question. The first is around the status of SEND, and drawing a comparison, really, a parallel between the status of SEND in your school and the status of pupil premium. In particular, again, if I think about governors, if I talk to governors, most of them will be able to tell me lots about what's going on with pupil premium or disadvantaged students, not least because there is a report that's published once a year that gives them lots of useful information, like how much money the school receives for pupil premium, what it's spent on, what the impact of that spend is. If I ask those same questions around how the SEN notional budget is spent, particularly for those students at the level of SEN support, I don't necessarily get the same level of understanding. And of course, that's a generalization that won't apply to every school. But I think on the whole, pupil premium in our education system has a far higher status than SEND and inclusion does. And so if that's the case in your school, you might think about how can we give it the same status? And one way might be on that report that governors get, for example, around pupil premium, do we want to actually look at what's happening for youngsters with SEND as well, particularly where there might be an overlap. So for those students who have both SEND and are also eligible for pupil premium, you might think of those youngsters as being triple funded but double disadvantaged. So double disadvantaged in the sense that you know, they have both SEND and disadvantaged in terms of socioeconomic background, but triple funded in the sense that they're eligible for pupil premium funding. They've got an element of the SEN notional budget or potentially even some EHC funding. And then they've also got the standard age-weighted funding that all pupils get as well. And thinking about that kind of combined level of funding and how that's used to impact the young person might be a useful thing to do. So I talk about governors there, but because I'm thinking about strategic improvements, but you can see how that status of SEND kind of echoes all the way through the different levels of a school. Second point really is around making SEND everybody's responsibility. And I've put here like safeguarding because I think that's a really useful analogy. If I talk to people about safeguarding, whose responsibility is safeguarding? The classic interview question. And of course the answer you get is, well, safeguarding is everybody's responsibility. When we talk about SEND being everybody's responsibility, as is indicated in the SEND Code of Practice, I don't think people interpret it in exactly the same way, because with safeguarding, yes, it's everybody's responsibility, but that means there's somebody running safeguarding, so you know, designated safeguarding lead, but everybody understands that they have a role to play and they understand what that role is. With SEND, I think people talk about it being everybody's responsibility, but in practice, it doesn't quite work out like that. So, for example, you might see in some lessons, the teaching assistant might be the one who is actually dealing with the young person with SEND or supporting that person. For the leadership level, it might be actually the head teacher might say, well, look, I'll run the school and Senko, you worry about children with SEND. And so there is this kind of passing on of responsibility. And again, it's a generalization. It won't be the same in every school, but it's not quite the same as safeguarding, where everybody understands that they have an individual role to play, even if you've got your Senko who's coordinating everything. So I would say to you, reflect on how you got to that point with safeguarding, where it genuinely is everybody's responsibility, and how could you get SEND into that same place? Sometimes people will say to me, well, we can't expect everybody to be responsible for SEND, Adam, because, you know, for a head teacher, for example, you wouldn't expect them to be an expert in mathematics because that's what they got a head of maths for. Isn't that the same with SEND? And I said, well, not really, no, because when we're talking about SEND and inclusion, that is a whole school responsibility. And one of the messages I really like, it's something that Apple use for the accessibility features on the iPhones and iPads and so on. And they talk about those features being vital for some, but valuable for all. And I see the same is true with SEND and inclusion. The kind of provision we put in place will be vital for some students. They couldn't access education without it. But actually, it's going to be really useful in general for the entire pupil population. This idea that what works for youngsters with SEND is actually just good practice overall is a good one and worth remembering. And again, that's just like safeguarding, isn't it? Actually, there are some students who need protection for whatever reason. They need that extra level. But actually, good safeguarding practice will protect all students. The next one is around every leader, a leader of SEND, and I'm going to come back to that one a bit later on. But the principle here is that the SEND Code of Practice talks about a requirement for every teacher to be a teacher of SEND, so they are responsible for the progress and attainment of every learner in their class, whether they have SEND or not. And actually that can only happen if every leader is a leader of SEND. And that goes back to some of the things I said before about having that more nuanced understanding of SEND, knowing Chapter 6 of the Code of Practice, knowing the 4 broad areas of need, being able to then ask the right questions in terms of those strategic discussions that are going on at school level. I want to talk about co-production next, which is, for those who are not familiar with this term, this is this idea of equal, meaningful partnership between families and between the school-based professionals, well, all professionals really. And I think what we had was this very rapid kind of rollout, if you like, of what was expected following the publication of the SEND Code of Practice, and people got their organisations to a place where they were compliant with the expectations of the legislation and policy and so on. What we haven't really seen since then, though, is a shift in the culture beyond that kind of compliance to being really meaningful. Actually, that's probably a bit unfair. We haven't seen that consistently across all schools. Some schools have really done this well. I mean, to the point where they've almost become so super inclusive, they become what I call SEND magnets. You know, these are the schools, and you'll know if you're one of these schools, the schools that are so inclusive that everybody in the area knows that this is the school to send your children to if you want their needs to be really well met. And they tell other families, and the school becomes bombarded actually with requests to join, because that is the school to get your children in. And then up the road there'll be another school who perhaps are saying things like, when the family with a young person with SEND comes to look around, they'll say things like, well, there's a school up the road there's a school up the road that'd be really good at meeting the needs of your child. So this kind of almost exclusion at the point of admission. And there's everything in between those two things. So it's not fair to say not everybody has had this culture shift. Some have had it, but I think it's not equitable across the piece. And actually, we shouldn't have a situation where some schools really do co-production and inclusion well, and others don't. We do need that general culture of inclusion to pervade right across our education system. So I just ask you to reflect on this co-production piece and how well that partnership works with families. One of the things I really like is this idea that when co-production works well, it's a kind of done with process rather than a done to or done for families. And so it might be worth just reflecting on where you are on that journey and whether there's more that could be done. And if you're not sure what more that can be done, ask the families, because I can guarantee they will give you a very honest assessment of where you are on that journey and what could easily be done. But again, that co-production stuff, you know, the conversations between the teacher and the family, because the family really understand the needs of their young person, experts, in fact, in the needs of their young person, and to share that knowledge with what's going on in the classroom. That doesn't cost anything. That's the cost of a bit of time for someone to have a conversation. You know, that can really make a big difference. So well worth doing. And the last one really was around maximising the impact of the Senko. And I'm going to reflect a little bit more on this on my next slide. But essentially, the Senko is one of the most highly qualified professionals in the school. I mean, a little fact for you if you didn't know this, there are only 2 professionals that are legally required in a school. One of them is the head teacher and the other one is a Senko. And of those two professionals, only one of them is required to be a qualified teacher, and it's not the head teacher. So for me, that tells you something about the status and the importance of that role. And because they are so highly qualified, they have to have the National Award for SEN Coordination. They've often undertaken a whole host of other qualifications off their own back as well, because they care about getting SEND and inclusion right. So we want to make sure that we obviously deploy them in the right way so we can get maximum benefit from them. But unfortunately, lots of them are spending time on paperwork and administration. And I said, look, if you've got your Senko spending most of their time on paperwork, then that is a very expensive administrator. You really want them looking at how inclusive teaching is across the school. What kind of strategies could teachers be using that would improve the kind of universal offer, that ordinarily available provision in schools? And you want your Senko really leading the charge on that. So one of the things I often would encourage leaders to do is say, look, is there some admin support that we could free up to support the Senko in discharging their duties so they can focus on more of that strategic, high quality development of inclusive teaching work? So it might be getting an assistant Senko maybe to pick up some of that, but really think about how you're deploying your Senko. Just to kind of summarize this page, I've just put a green box here to kind of separate out what the different responsibilities might be between governors, head teachers and Senkos in this space. But you'll have the recording and you can go back and look at that. But I think I've covered most of this as I've been going through. So I said I'd come back to every leader or leader of SEND, and also the kind of maximising the impact of the Senko here. So in terms of maximising the impact of the Senko, there are these 5 areas here which are included in the Effective Senko Deployment Guide, which is in the top right of the screen here. I think my face is covering the end of that word, sorry. But essentially what we're saying here is five things. So first one is about membership of the senior leadership team. The SEND Code of Practice is really clear that Senko should be a member of the school leadership team. I'd take that further and say there should be a member of the senior leadership team. And that is the case in more than 50% of schools overall. But you might have a look and see, is that the case for Senkos in your school? And would you want it to be? Because then they can really influence strategic decision making. I would rather have a Senko in the room when I was making those decisions. In terms of the team around a Senko, that's the point I was making before around admin support and around the assistant Senko. Effective performance management. So I've got here the Senko induction pack on the right hand side. I just reflect on this for a moment. So this was put together as one of the resources, the Whole School SEND Consortium, in partnership with the National Senko Award providers. And it was designed to be a kind of, look, I'm day one in the job as a Senko. Perhaps I haven't finished doing the qualification yet, or I haven't started that. But actually the job doesn't wait for you. You've got to get on with it. So what do I need to know? How do I get started? What's really important? And it gives a really good induction to new Senkos. But what we found was that actually school leaders said, well, this is a really useful tool for me, because if I'm doing performance management of the Senko, I've got a much better understanding now of what my Senko should be doing, what success looks like. So I can therefore be much more effective in terms of my performance management. And that's the point that I just wanted to make there. By the way, also experienced Senkos are liking this document, because they said, yes, I know all this stuff, but isn't it a great reference point? And SEND governors who are obviously routinely meeting up with Senkos are saying, well, brilliant, this gives me some idea of the kinds of things I should be asking the Senko about. So well worth a read from a number of different perspectives, even though it was written with new Senkos in mind. The next point on here is around time. How much time does your Senko have to undertake the role? I'm going to come on to some research in a second, which talks a little bit about the amount of time that Senko has been given. But essentially, most Senkos say that there is not enough time to do the job well. And again, some of that is around the paperwork, but some of that is around the actual protected time that Senkos have and them getting pulled away for other responsibilities and so on. So really make sure your Senko has sufficient time to do the job well. And we've got some recommendations in the research that I'll show you in a minute about what that looks like. And then lastly, but not leastly, of course, we've got effective co-production with parents, which I talked about a few moments ago. The other document on here that I've not mentioned, the demonstrating inclusion tool, every leader, a leader of SEND. This is for leaders thinking about, actually, how do I know if my school is inclusive, and how could I demonstrate that to other people? And there's some really useful content in there that gives an idea of some of the metrics and some of the indicators that you might look at to kind of get a sense of how inclusive your school is, and where, in fact, you could be even more inclusive. So do take a look at that. Okay, right. I mentioned about this research. Started out with the Senko workload survey back in 2018, and it was a partnership between NASON, Bath Spa University, and the National Education Union were involved at that point as well. And it was led by my colleague, Dr. Helen Curran from Bath Spa University. We had more than 1,900 responses, so really good response from Senkos. And these were some of the findings from that survey back in 2018. I should just add at this point that in the next few weeks, we will be publishing the most recent survey from 2020, which makes some comparisons to the findings in 2018 and what's happening now in 2020 and what has changed, and make some really interesting comparisons there to have a look at. So I'd encourage you to keep an eye out for that when the time comes. So what were the findings? Well, 71% of Senkos said that they enjoy the job. They enjoy the role most or all of the time. Well, brilliant. I mean, what a rewarding job, right? Being a Senko and supporting children every day of the week. 74% of Senkos, though, said that they actually don't have enough time to ensure that pupils at the level of SEN support can access the provision they need. Now, remember, we've got more than 1 million children in England who are at the level of SEN support, and that's going up every year. So actually, if we're in a situation where 3/4 of Senkos are saying, look, we haven't got enough time to get it right for these 1 million children, then we've got a problem, and that needs to be addressed. And it goes back to that time point earlier on and what Senkos are spending their time on and how much time they have to start off with. Now, you might say, well, actually, the reason they haven't got enough time to support those people is because they're supporting those with education, health and care plans, those with the more complex needs. But actually, even then, only 1/4 of Senkos said they had enough time to do that. So we've still got the case where more than 3/4 of Senkos don't have enough time to support those pupils. So what are they doing? Well, it's paperwork, it's other things pulling them away from the role. So sometimes Senko's the go-to person to pick up all kinds of issues that come up in the school. There is a kind of general issue around how well the role is understood. So fewer than half of Senkos felt that their role was actually understood by senior leaders. So that's that Senko induction pack I was talking about before, where that can help. But most worrying perhaps is this statistic here that only just over 1/3 of Senkos actually intend to be in the role in 5 years' time. So what does that suggest? That suggests we've got a 2/3 churn in the workforce, which is a very large number of Senkos that we're having to replace. Now, the 2020 data actually looks into where those Senkos who aren't in the role are going, because it's very different if they're going into leadership positions to if they're leaving the profession altogether or doing other things. So do watch this space for that. As well as the kind of the 2018 and 2020 survey, we did also publish some research in January this year, which looked at the specific issue around COVID and how Senkos had coped with that. By the way, I should just mention before, all of these reports that I'm talking about, you can find on the Bath Spa University website. So the link is here on the screen, but equally, if you just do a search for Senko survey Bath Spa, it will come up. And this one had more than 1,000 responses. And essentially what we found was that during COVID, we saw this amplification of pre-existing strengths and challenges. So where co-production was really strong, prior to the pandemic, that got even stronger during the pandemic, and those relationships really served the families and the young people and the professionals involved in that very, very well. But actually, where things were not quite in place, the provision wasn't quite right, the identification of needs maybe wasn't there. Actually, that's come even worse over this time as well. One of the things, I know that multi-academy trusts and academies in general sometimes get a bit of a bad press, and this isn't particularly a political point, but one of the things that we saw in the research was that those Senkos who were part of a multi-academy trust really felt supported because they were part of a very close network of other Senkos in that same multi-academy trust, and that seemed to be something that worked very, very well. Moving forwards, there is this kind of prioritization of social, emotional and mental health, and I've got some of the general findings from the survey here, which you can have a look at your leisure. But I wanted to particularly flag this slide here, which looks at, we gave a whole load of different priorities. I think about 12 in total, and we asked Senkos to prioritize what was going to be most important coming out of the pandemic. And what was really interesting here was that irrespective of the phase, primary, secondary, special and alternative provision, social, emotional, mental health and well-being right up there at the top. And the same broad things were in there everywhere else. But actually this was right up there out of all the 12 different things. And I would just add to this that whilst this is about mental health and well-being of learners, what came through the survey quite strongly is that also the mental health and well-being of staff and families more broadly, because of the pressures that have been on people during this time, is going to be really, really important. And I just make a particular plea around school leaders who, you know, the nature of school leaders, I think, is they just do whatever is required, and they will have over the past 12 months been absorbing stress from all sides, from the constant kind of policy change. They will have been absorbing that, so it didn't impact the staff. But equally, staff will have been stressed and having bereavements, and children will have had all kinds of pressures on them as well. And head teachers will have just soaked this up, and Senkos as well. And you know, what happens when it comes to the end of this? Are we going to have a sudden exodus of Senkos and school leaders from the workforce? I hope not, but irrespective, we need to make sure that we are there for them as much as we are for the young people, because we need them to be in the right place to be able to carry on to give a good offer going forward. I talked earlier on about the kind of strategic questions that you might ask about SEND, and I'm not particularly going to spend a long time on this slide, but I suppose these are kind of 5 questions that I always think are useful questions to think about. And some of them relate to things I've talked about already, and they're kind of general because I think they can apply in almost every context. So, you know, we talked about the distribution of the 4 broad areas. Actually, do we know whether we've got more children who have a speech language communication need compared to a social, emotional, mental health need? You know, are our resources aligned to that? How does that compare with other schools in our area or nationally? What proportion of pupils actually have EHC plans and have the level of SEN support? And again, does the way that we deploy our staff and our resources align to that? The notional budget and the impact of pupils, that comes back to that point I made earlier on about pupil premium. Now, the Equality Act 2010, now this is an interesting one around reasonable adjustments, and it's an area that I sometimes see schools fall foul of by mistake, really. And it's just making this point that the reasonable adjustments are an anticipatory duty. And what does that mean? So it means that you can't just wait for someone to come along and say, oh, we hadn't thought about that someone might come along with these types of needs. We now need to do something. There's a requirement almost to kind of do that forward thinking. What kinds of needs might we reasonably expect that we will need to meet in our school, and how can we make sure that we're ready for them? So that's just an important one to be aware of. And last one, perhaps the most important one, asking that overt, explicit question: are we an inclusive school? How do we know that? Have we asked children? Have we asked families? Have we asked the teachers if we're inclusive? And what do they say? Now, of course, I've talked a lot about strategic leadership today and so on. And we know, of course, that leaders are acting in a way that they feel is ethically right. But it's hard. It's hard because often there are trade-offs, and if you make one decision, it will support some children more than others. And there are these really hard decisions and choices that leaders have to make. So in thinking about the kind of ethics of that, I came across these 3 tests, which were not necessarily designed with education in mind, but I do think they're quite useful if you're a leader and you're thinking about, actually, have I made the right decision? Not even just a leader, I think anybody making a decision, really, and kind of not sure about it. So the 3 tests are these. So the first one is the public test, which is sometimes known as the newspaper test. And the principle here is that if all the information that you had that informed the decision that you've made was put out into the public domain, and along with the decision that you made and the rationale for it, and it was kind of, if you like, on the front page of the national newspapers, and all your friends and family would read it, and colleagues and so on, would you feel comfortable with them reading that and knowing how you made that decision on the basis of the information available? And if the answer is no, then think about why that might be the case, and that will perhaps lead you to a slightly different outcome. But equally, if the answer is yes, then that's great, right? So you feel confident in your convictions there. The second one is the parent test, sometimes known as the child test, and this works on the basis that people will often give their own children better advice than they might give to themselves, and that applies to your family and friends more broadly, I suppose. But it's this idea that if your child or someone you know comes to you for advice, and imagine they were coming to you with the very decision that you've got to make, what advice would you give to them? And it's this idea that you would hold others to a higher ethical bar or expectation than perhaps you would for yourself. And again, that might lead you to review your particular course of action. And the last one, perhaps the simplest one, the pillow test, sometimes known as the sleep test. Can you sleep easy at night with the decision that you've made? And if not, then perhaps it's worth rethinking. And you know, I always see rethinking decisions, if we've made a mistake, as being a strength, not necessarily a weakness. Anyway, I hope that that's helpful. It's just something I came across unrelated to SEND, but I think can be applied to this context. I wanted to just share this diagram here, which is actually from the Education Endowment Foundation, and it talks about the gaps in academic attainment between different groups. And lots of these you'll be familiar with in terms of gaps between boys and girls, those who are English versus non-English backgrounds, disadvantaged versus other pupils, free school meals versus other pupils, and so on. But the biggest gap by a long way is those with SEN and those without SEN. Now, you might say, well, of course, that's going to happen by definition, right? Because you know the way in which we define SEN is directly related to academic attainment and progress. However, that doesn't necessarily apply universally, and in particular, I would make the point around cognitive versus non-cognitive needs, and I'm going to come on to give a specific example of how that might work in terms of specific data in a second. But just because a student has SEN, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will not be able to achieve academically. Some won't, and we need to think about a broader notion of outcomes, and again, I'll come on to that. But actually, we shouldn't be doing a disservice by having lower expectations for others. So, for example, just because someone has a vision impairment doesn't mean that they're going to be any less able academically, and so I think there is work that we can do in terms of, again, the nuance of understanding this type of data. So I said I'd just look at this in the context of data. So this is some anonymized data from a primary school. So this is Key Stage 2 attainment data. So we can see the reading, writing and maths, the proportion of pupils achieving the expected standard, then the combined amount, and then the reading higher standard and maths higher standard, and the writing greater depth. And again, the proportion of pupils hitting that, and then the combined. And I think what's interesting here is we've got that data nationally, we've got what it is for all schools, and then we've got it is that is split out by those without SEND and those with SEND. And I think what I'm showing you here on the screen is quite typical of what you might expect to see if you were a governor, for example, or even for school leaders just routinely analysing data. I've seen this quite a lot in various governance roles. And I think what's interesting here is that when we think about the broad areas, sorry, not the broad areas, the primary areas of need that are in the census data that I mentioned earlier on, I've listed them down the side of the screen here. Out of all of those areas of needs, only these three are actually related to cognition and learning. And so one of the things I would encourage schools to do is that SEND category, if you like, is to split it up between non-cognitive needs and cognitive needs. Now, that sounds very simple when I say it like that. It's more complex than that, of course, because of the co-occurring needs that I talked about right at the beginning of today. But you know, even broad brush to get a sense of this would be helpful, because otherwise the risk is that for those with non-cognitive needs, it could be that their academic results are, if you like, inflating the overall performance of children with SEND because they're higher than those with cognitive needs. But it also might mean that we're not getting a true idea of whether that non-cognitive group are meeting their academic potential as well. So I think it kind of has a bit of a double whammy effect both sides. But by splitting it out in this way, I think it's more useful. And if I look at the numbers in this particular example here, so we can see here that those with non-cognitive SEND are clearly not doing as well as those without SEND, and we would expect them to be doing as good as, at least, or if not even better than those without SEND. And we can also see in that kind of highlighted column there, the kind of cognitive SEND, that those are doing a lot worse than perhaps it looked when we just looked at SEND itself. So this is a kind of a level of nuance, and you could break it down a lot more if you wanted to, but I think this is a good first step into kind of really understanding the different types of needs and the impact and the outcomes. You might say, okay, but what about those pupils with education, health and care plans? And one of the things I think it's useful to do is to say, well, what proportion of children who have an education, health and care plan are on track to meet the targets specified in those plans? So almost irrespective of what the targets are, because that will be individual for each person. But actually, are they on track to achieve them? And that will be a blend of different things around preparation for adulthood, about skills development, about social development. Some of that might be about academic outcomes as well. But actually, we want to know as a leadership team, if I've got 10 or 20 or 30 pupils, actually, are they on track to achieve those targets? And you might think 10, 20, 30, that sounds like a lot, Adam, for a number of children with EHC plans. Well, it depends on the size of the school, but I'm thinking it also applies to those with individual education plans. And who am I talking about there? So there will be some students who have fairly complex needs. They are not eligible or haven't got an education, health and care plan. Maybe they're in the process for that, or maybe they don't quite meet the threshold for that. But actually, we do need to think of outcomes for some of those pupils with a much broader sense. So it's not just academic outcomes, it's other outcomes as well. So we would also want to know what's happening with those. And the data here, for example, is showing that actually for those who have the statutory education, health and care plan, 85% of those are on track. But actually for those who had an individual education plan, actually we're not doing so well for those who've got cognitive needs. The academic outcomes aren't necessarily the right thing, but actually they're not achieving it in other outcomes either. I've mentioned a few times today this this idea around the primary areas of need and how you might use them. So I've got some data here, which is for an invented high school in Blackpool. So it's called the Lady Vedetta High School, and the kind of regional data and national data you can get off the DFE website. And what I'm suggesting is a good exercise for schools to do is to compare their own data with what's going on regionally and nationally. Now, and this is about the kind of spread of needs, if you like, the prevalence of different needs in your school. What I'm not saying is that it needs to be the same as what's happening regionally or nationally. But actually it does lead you to ask some really interesting questions. So for example, in this diagram here, I can see moderate learning difficulties at Lady Vedetta High School are far higher than what's going on regionally and nationally. Now, why is that? Is that because we just have more students with moderate learning difficulties, perhaps, or a greater proportion of them, I should say? Or is it because we're using moderate learning difficulties as a bit of a catch-all and we're not really properly identifying needs? So we need to really kind of get under the skin of that and understand what's going on. Similarly, we can see speech language communication needs are significantly lower than what's going on in the local area. Now, that could be because we're really good at meeting speech language communication needs, and so the identification of those needs comes down because we're meeting them in school. It could be because we're seriously under identifying those needs. So we really need to just understand those problems. And when I look below that, I see social, emotional, and mental health needs is much higher. Is that because we've got students with anxiety because their speech language communication needs aren't being met? It could be any one of these things I've discussed. It could be something completely different. But what a good conversation to have in terms of understanding SEND and inclusion at school level. One of the big tensions in terms of government policy is around behaviour and inclusion. So, you know, the government has a big focus on behaviour expectations in school. It also wants schools to be inclusive, and I think this is an area where policy kind of regularly butts up against each other in terms of what the expectation is. My only kind of plea on this really would be to say, look, when you're looking at behaviour, your first thought should be children don't want to intentionally go out and misbehave, be bad. I just don't think that's inherent in what children are. But actually, that behaviour is a form of communication. They are trying to communicate to you that something is perhaps not right. So if we see behaviour as a communication of need, what are we doing as a school to make sure that we are meeting those needs? And only when we've exhausted all of that should we start down the road of sanctions and all these other things. Anyway, we might get into a big debate about that because I'm sure there will be a range of views on that. If it's useful, Ofsted's position on this, as I read it from the latest version of their framework, is that no school can now be graded outstanding unless they can also demonstrate that they're inclusive. How do you demonstrate that you're inclusive? Well, it comes back to that demonstrating inclusion tool that we saw a little earlier today. Now, in terms of behaviour, obviously exclusions is an area that is often talked about. And the Timpson review into school exclusions really kind of had a razor sharp look at this. And one of the diagrams from that review is here on the screen. And it's an odds ratio diagram. And essentially what this diagram is doing is you're saying, if you have particular types of SEND, how many more times likely are you to be permanently excluded than if you had no SEND at all? So the way this diagram works is, if you look at the black horizontal line, it goes along the bottom. That's a kind of number one. And then ignore all the orange dots and things. But if you look at the kind of bars, they're saying how many more times you are likely to be excluded if you have that particular need. And what's interesting is if you look at what I call the big four here, the tallest four bars, two of them you won't be surprised. So behavioural, emotional and social difficulties looks like it's about 6 times more likely to be excluded. One of them there is around social, emotional and mental health needs. And so perhaps you might expect that, but the other two large ones are SEN type not recorded and no specialist assessment. Now, what does that tell me? That suggests to me that there is a direct line between failing to accurately identify what needs are and permanent exclusion. Because if we don't know what the needs are, how can they possibly be met effectively? So if you're looking to reduce exclusions, one of the things I would encourage you to do is to go all the way back to identification of SEND and say, actually, have we got the identification of SEND right here, and how do we know? I want to say just very briefly really about the Ofsted local area SEND inspections. Ofsted and the Care Quality Commission have been commissioned to develop a new framework. So the existing one is kind of coming to an end, but that's going to kind of go on now, and it will be a continuous cycle rather than going around to visit everybody kind of the once or doing revisits. And it's going to have a much sharper focus on the experience of children with young people, the experience of children and young people with SEND and their families. I personally think there should also be a much greater link into early years and into what's going on in schools as part of that as well, maybe to identify some of those issues I raised earlier on about the SEND magnets and the kind of exclusion at the point of admission and so on. I've also included a list of other things that are likely to kind of form part of that here for you to kind of have a look at. I particularly just point out there SEN support, which I'm going to come to in a short while, and also preparation for adulthood, which at the moment feels like it happens more towards the kind of secondary school end of things and probably not enough in the primary school end of things. But again, that's a kind of generalization, and it won't be the case everywhere. Just a bit of kind of theory, I suppose, just in terms of the way in which we view SEND and inclusion in this country. And I just asked this question as, when does the absence of a particular ability become a disability? And I ask it in this way because sometimes when we think about disability, we're already thinking about the kind of lack of something, and that can make it hard to kind of see things in an objective way. So instead of that, I want to talk about the lack of some kind of superpower instead, and just look at it through that lens. So let's suppose that some people can fly in our world, and let's imagine we've got in this world 2% of people can fly. They've got this superpower. Most people can't. 98% of people can't fly. And I'll just ask you to reflect for a moment that if you were part of the group that could not fly, so that 98%, would you consider yourself to have a disability? Now, I've asked this question at a lot of conferences and so on, and the answer seems to be, well, no, I wouldn't consider myself to have a disability because I'm in with the majority, the 98%. It's the kind of norm, if you like, in inverted commas. In fact, I'd probably see those 2% of people who've got this kind of tremendous superpower, the super ability, as being really kind of gifted in some way. You know, that's really fabulous that they can do that, but it's not a particular issue for me to be worried about. Then I said, well, let's flip that on its head. Let's imagine a world now where 98% of people can fly, but you're in the 2% that can't fly. Would you now consider yourself to have a disability? And the overwhelming response to this question is, well, yes, because actually everybody else can fly. And I'm thinking, why can't I fly? And what's interesting about comparing these two scenarios is nothing about the individual person or their ability has changed. In scenario 1, you couldn't fly. In scenario 2, you couldn't fly. What's changed? Well, everybody around you has changed, and that gives some sense of what the norm is. I don't really like that phrase, so forgive me. But also probably the world is then built for people that can fly. So I don't know, if 98% of people are flying, there's probably supermarkets in the sky and this kind of thing, which then you can't access. Whereas actually in the first scenario, the world is probably designed for the 98% of people who couldn't fly. So the point I'm making here is that we shouldn't always see kind of disability as being about the individual person. It can be just as much, if not more, about the wider environment. And this comes back to this idea of the social model and the medical model of disability, which I haven't got time to explore in more detail today, but essentially you can think of the social model as being more about the wider environment and barriers to participation and access, and the medical model as being more about the individual and fixing the individual and what they can do and what they can't do and so on. And in practice in this country, we kind of have what we call the interactionist model, which kind of pivots a little bit between the two for different things. To put that in the context of schools, that model, you know, this is quite a famous diagram, which I'm sure you will have seen before, which talks about equality and equity. And if you imagine the crates as bundles of resources that you as a leader can use, you might want to give everybody an equal amount of resource. And as you can see from the left-hand diagram here, that works well for some, not so well for others. So you might say, well, look, I'll kind of target my resource to those that need it most. And that's equity, right? Fairness. But then the person on the left might say, yeah, I can see over the fence, but actually I could have risen much taller if I'd been given some of that resource as well. That's not really fair. So there are issues there. But in some ways, this is all a bit of a red herring, and this third version of the picture is not so well known. And I call it liberation, which is what we do is we don't focus on the crates, we focus on using that resource instead to take the fence down altogether. And this is a bit like the difference between the medical model and social model. The equity one is kind of focused on, you know, helping the individual to be where they need to be, whereas the liberation is about actually is the wider context that we're operating in here the problem rather than the crates. So it's the removing that barrier, that fence altogether. Okay, my next few slides I'm going to skim over because they talk about the kind of strategic and operational elements of the Senko role, which I've talked about already. So I'm going to zoom past those. I did just want to flag this piece of research from the Education Endowment Foundation, which was published last year, and it talks about the kind of universal high quality teaching strategies that can be used, particularly at the level of SEN support, to support special educational needs in the classroom. And it's a pulling together of lots of really high quality research over a period of time to say, look, what are the key messages coming through that? I recognise that it's probably quite small to read on this slide, but I put the web address there, and I would absolutely encourage you, if you're a teacher, to go and have a look at this. There won't be anything that I think is a surprise to you, but hopefully it reinforces some of the good things that you're already doing. I mentioned about high needs funding earlier on. Again, just a bit of data from the National Audit Office here in relation to that. And basically this diagram shows that local authorities are increasingly overspending on the high needs funding block. And this data only runs to 2017-18. I suspect it's probably virtually every local authority in the country now that might be in that kind of red section. But let's hope that the SEN review, when it comes, will do something to address some of those pressures that we know exist on the high needs funding block. Wanted to briefly mention the Education Committee recommendations. Essentially, this was a report looking at the kind of implementation of the SEN reforms, and it said, look, we had the right reforms, but actually we haven't funded them properly. We haven't tied it in sufficiently to wider policy change to really kind of realise the vision that was there. And this was, if you like, the forerunner for what is now the SEN review. And a number of requests were made in there, one of which I'd just like to point out here at the bottom, which is that the DFE should look at the cost implications of requiring all schools and colleges to have a full-time dedicated Senko, which I think would be really helpful in terms of that SEN support and thinking about the time that Senkos have, particularly to meet those levels of need at the SEN support level that we talked about earlier on. And I suppose I wanted to finish by just briefly talking about the SEN review. Obviously, not a lot I can say about this because there will be a consultation coming and we'll be able to look at those. But really just wanted to say that a few things I hope that might be addressed as part of that review. The first is that at the moment, local authorities, I think, have this conflict of interest situation where they are both setting the threshold at which an EHC plan can be given, but also then have to fund whatever's in that plan, which I think gives them a perverse disincentive, if you like, to put hurdles in the way. So I hope that would be looked at. There is far too much regional disparity in terms of you can have two students with very similar levels of need who don't get similar levels of provision because they're in different parts of the country. We need to look at being really clear about what families and young people with SEN can actually expect routinely from schools and really articulate that clearly, and then put in the funding and the accountability that goes with that so schools can deliver on what that is. I talked about identification exclusions already in terms of the accuracy of identification to reduce exclusions. And there is this kind of anomaly, in my view, that further education colleges have to abide by the SEN Code of Practice, but higher education institutions don't. And if we're serious about 0 to 25 provision, and we put all this effort to get children with SEN through school and get them into university, only to then say, actually, universities, you don't need to worry about the Code of Practice, that seems to be very odd to me. So I think it would be good to look at that again. That probably falls beyond the remit of what the SEN review it will cover, but I put it in there anyway because I think it's a good thing to look at. Okay, last couple of things before I finish. I promised I would just share some useful resources and so on. Whole School Send, I've got this whole suite of review guides here based on the original Send review, and there's lots of these. So if you go to the Send Gateway website, you'll be able to download these. They're all editable as well. So if you want to change them to fit the language that you use in your school, or to line up with your school development plan and put your own school logo on it and all of that, please do that. Even better, tell us that you've done it and share it with us, because that might inform future iterations of these guides as we go forwards. I just also wanted to point out there that there is this bottom left here, condition-specific introductory videos for NQTs. There's a whole series of videos which are designed to give an introduction to very specific conditions. So, for example, if you find you've got someone in your class with dyscalculia and you think, oh, I've never had somebody with dyscalculia before, where do I go for resources? How do I adapt my lessons and so on? This doesn't give you all the answers, but it's certainly a really good starting point for looking at that. There's a whole range of resources here which are to do with the return to school and COVID and transition after a period of absence from school as well. And again, you can get those from the Send Gateway website. And I particularly just point out that these two things, three things here. So one is the developmental language disorder resources. We work with ICANN on those. They are available on the Send Gateway website now, as is the Autism Resource Suite, which we worked in partnership with Autism Education Trust on. Coming soon, hopefully in June, is the Classroom Teacher Send Handbook, which is a bit of an all things Send for all teachers, if you like, and it's enormous but really, really helpful. So please keep an eye out for that when it comes out. Indeed, as I said earlier on, follow me on Twitter. You can see the information down in the bottom left there, and you'll be obviously one of the first to find out when that does come out. Lastly, a little plug for my own recent book, which I published in January this year, which is the Governance Handbook for Send and Inclusion, Schools at Work for All Learners, available on the Routledge website. Or if you email me, I can send you a link, or if you tweet at me, I'll send you a link. And I think it's on Amazon and stuff as well. So please do have a look at that. Okay, so that was a very rapid whistle-stop tour of lots of things about Send and Inclusion, lots of data, national policy, research, and so on. Hopefully, as I said at the beginning, you've got at least one thing that you're going to do differently now as a result of that. Please do tweet or email me. My details are here. If you have comments, questions, thoughts, ideas, suggestions, I'd love to hear from you. And thank you for listening. Okay, goodbye.